Good evening, everyone. My name's Anne Havard, and I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network. And tonight, it's my privilege to welcome you all to the start of our Lenten journey, the body of Christ, blessed, broken, excluded. And this evening, we begin with Understanding Matters LGBTQ in 2022, the historical background to how we got here. And our companion for the evening is James Alison. So welcome, James.
Thank you.
But as always, we start by invoking the Holy Spirit, the protagonist of this series, to come into our hearts and minds. And we still ourselves as we pray.
Come, Holy Spirit, Liberator, cleanse our minds and hearts of anything that is not of you, and give us the courage to leave behind all that prevents us from being truly one with the mind, heart, and mission of Jesus.
And now we'll spend a minute in silent prayer. On this journey, we've turned to those with experience to help us, and we are delighted that our Lenten journey is being co-badged by both Quest and Million Minutes. So now I welcome Gerard Swan, who chairs Quest. I would like to invite him to tell us a bit about it, and then to introduce our companion for the evening, James Alison. Over to you, Gerard.
Thanks, Anne. Well, hi everyone. It's great to be here this evening, and I'm Gerard Swan. I'm the chair to Quest. My pronouns are he, him, his. I've been a member of Quest since about 1996. And it's perhaps helpful to say that Quest was my last-ditch attempt with Catholicism and the Catholic Church. I'm still here, sometimes still hanging on by a very thin thread. I don't think that's unusual for many Catholics, but I'm still here. Before I tell you a little bit about Quest, I just wanted to say that Quest is delighted and privileged to be asked to co-badge this Lenten series and to support the exploration of this really, really important theme. I think particularly so at this time of great hope as we see the movement of the Spirit, I have to say, not only in the Catholic Church, but in the different circles that I occupy. I think that movement is seen in other faith-based groups around the UK as well. So I think it's part of a shift in a bigger landscape, not just the Catholic Church, although very welcome, I have to say, within the Catholic Church. I also want to say I can't fully express what it means for me personally, both as a gay man and as the current chair to this nearly 50-year-old organisation, to be here in this space and to be co-badging with the Scottish Laity Network and Million Minutes. demonstrate such progress, I think, in our Catholic landscape. So it's great to be here this evening, and thank you to the network for inviting us to be part of this. So a little bit about Quest. We're a small charity. I like to think that we punch above our weight, and we have been doing since our origins. And we go back to about 1973. The story is that a young Welsh guy visits his local priest and kind of comes out to him and says, I'm homosexual, I'm Catholic, what do I do? And the priest's response was, well, you don't, and you can't. Anyway, as was the case for many young gay men at the time, he moved to London, but he put an ad in the Gay News then and said, I'm gay, I'm Catholic, anyone else out there and want to explore what that means? What does that look like? How do we reconcile those two things? And he had about 19 people respond, half of whom met together, and from there they kind of coalesced this little group that kind of grew, and word spread about the group, and the group got bigger, and then word spread across the country, and so developed Quest as we know it now. Once a city-based organization with groups all across the country, kind of shrunk a little bit over the years, and we're now a regionally based organization with groups in Scotland, the North, the Midlands, London and the Southeast and the Southwest. We're about 190 Quest members now, but our regional groups have an additional reach of a further 180 people. So our work is still quite extensive. Nationally, as an organisation, we're involved in what I might describe as advocacy work. So we network with other national faith groups. Some of you will have heard of the ban conversion therapy work that's going on here down in England. We work with others against the huge backlash that we see against our trans siblings at the moment. We also stand outside, and I always find this one difficult to describe, but we stand outside the direct authority of any of the UK bishops, unlike some other groups that are around who kind of work but within the auspices of a particular diocese. So that offers an independence, and I think that independence is perhaps a little like the independence that the Scottish Laity Network have. That said, we're happy to work with bishops and other diocesan groups, such as Caritas, as an example, and we'll work with them openly or discreetly. We're not interested in having public credit for the work we do. It's nice when we get it, but we're more interested in changing that landscape that I keep referring to. So currently there are 7 diocesan initiatives within England. Sadly, we haven't seen that work progress north of the border, but ever hopeful. And we also run a national conference exploring issues that impact on LGBT plus Catholics. And then within our regional groups, each group has its own flavour. And they organise their own programmes of events and support, but activities are social, reflective, spiritual, things like day walks with a pub lunch, but also perhaps house masses or day retreats. But all of our work is with the aim of supporting folk to integrate their Catholic faith with their sexuality and their gender identity. So that's a little bit about Quest, but now on to this evening. And I really am delighted to welcome back to the network as our companion on this journey this evening, Father James Alison. James is a Catholic theologian, priest and an author. We'll put the link to his website. I'll also put the link to some links to information about Quest in the chat box in a little while. But if you do a YouTube search for James, you'll find a rich source of offerings for those like myself who like to take a break from reading and just listen sometimes. And I love listening to James on a range of topics, but in particular on issues LGBT+. I have to say, food for my soul. I think James may have described himself once, and forgive me, James, if I've got this wrong, please correct me. And I think you've talked about the Pope Francis, and yourself as being conservative. And if I've got that right, if I've understood, then what I've taken away is that unlike most of those who are described as conservative, those who are selective in the tools and perhaps weapons that they bring to the table, James and Francis value that which is truly Catholic in their conservatism. They value the Jesus of the Gospels and the down-to-earth and often messy lives that folk live. The people that Jesus enjoyed the company of. And I think that conservatism includes the truth and the liberation that our baptism offers, that we're children of the resurrection. And unlike the experience for LGBT plus people across the world at times, we're not children who need continually crucifying. And what I think both James and Francis offer us is the hope that comes with the resurrection of Christ. And that, as I say, that we are children of the resurrection. As was noted last time that James was a companion with the network, James's own faith journey has overcome many hurdles, including a lengthy process of being treated a bit like the ball in a pinball machine, I think was the analogy that was used, when he was suspended by church authorities from active ministry in part over his LGBT plus affirming work. And as many of you know, James received a phone call from that conservative Pope Francis back in July 2017, in which our brother, the Pope, told James, "I want you to walk with deep interior freedom, following the Spirit of Jesus, and I give you the power of the keys." Simple phone call, but an incredibly powerful gesture about the call of the gospel and about the truth of our baptism and the resurrection of Christ in our lives. So here this evening, James is going to explore with us understanding matters LGBTQ in 2022, some historical background for how we got here. So I'm really chuffed to welcome you, James, this evening, and to hand over to you, James.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. It's a delight to be with you again, and I'm delighted to be under the various umbrellas, the Scottish National Laity umbrella, the Quest umbrella, and a good deal of what I'm going to be talking about is actually owed to the writings of a now sadly deceased but brilliant former Quest member, Alan Bray, who was a wonderful social historian, really one of the best of his generation throughout the English-speaking world, and was widely recognized as such when his last book came out posthumously with the Chicago University Press. But what I want to do is to give just a little bit sense of historical background to how we got to where we are now, because I think it makes, we begin to get more of a sense of where we are and why the church has difficulty and where the church is now beginning to shift, all of which we've seen actually happening, as Jared has pointed out. All of this is very much ongoing. So I'm going to try and be a bit anecdotal, because sometimes history is best told by anecdotes. But I just want to bring out something of the changes in world. Above all, the changes in world over the last 500 years that have made what we're talking about today possible. And to begin this, I'd like to go back almost exactly 500 years to the early years of the 16th century, to Essex, the Essex Assizes. I'm sure there are still Essex Assizes today. I don't know where they're held, probably Colchester, but somewhere like that. And at these Essex Assizes, a modern magistrate, a good Tudor bureaucrat, a modern who was thoroughly up in what passed as the modern learning of the time, was trying a case. He was trying to get a jury to convict two men, whom let us call Fred and Joe, Fred and Joe, on their way home from the pub one evening, had fallen to a certain playfulness under a bush on the route back home, and someone had noticed them in flagrante delicto, and someone had reported this to someone, and eventually it had come to the attention of the magistrate, who decided that he needed to try them for sodomy. So there they were, Fred and Joe, in court, and there was the magistrate attempting to persuade the jury that these two were guilty of sodomy. And he went on and on and on about how it was sodomy. And the more he went on, the less the jury believed him. And it was very interesting that records of this assize survive. And this was one of the things that Alan Bray brought to our attention, was this rather wonderful story, was that the jury eventually explained to the magistrate why they could not find Fred and Joe guilty. And it was quite simple. They said, listen, all our lives we've been hearing about sodomy. We've been hearing sermons about it really since we were kids in first communion classes. We know that it's a terrible sin. It's such a terrible sin that it causes the very order of creation to shake. It causes mass infertility to break out amongst the crops and the cattle. It causes fire and lightning and sulfur to come down from brimstone, to come down from heaven. And it's such a terrible sin that you really have got to be terribly important to be able to commit it. Because you see, we've seen nothing terrible of the sort that has happened around us. And we know that sodomy, for it to work, for it to cause this breakdown of the order of creation, it would have to be done by someone really high up in the order of creation, like the king or one of the king's top counselors. But Fred and Joe, we know them well. To be frank, they're not important enough to commit the sin of sodomy. That is why we're finding them innocent. You've got the charge wrong. So I bring that out because it takes us back to a different world. It's the end of the medieval world, in which sodomy meant any number of different things, but nothing particularly clearly, but was widely held to be something so terrible that when what we would call sodomy happened under people's noses, they didn't think it was sodomy. Just to give you an idea of how that worked. But what you get over the next 100 years, and in particular from the beginning of the 17th century, is a major change in what we now call modern society. And this major change is something without which I don't think we can really understand what's going on now. The change is referred to by historians as the invention of companionate marriage, or we might call it the discovery of heterosexuality. Now, by the discovery of heterosexuality, I don't mean that until the 17th century, babies were randomly produced by storks. I mean that marriage was by and large decided by adults and not by the young people who themselves were to get married. And the issues involved were things like clan security, kinship protection, property rights, things like that. But what historians have begun to notice, and what indeed the people themselves began to notice from the beginning of the 17th century, in the south of England, in the north of France, and in the Low Countries, all those parts of the world which are currently under huge lorry jams, truck jams, thanks to Brexit, in that part of the world, there began to appear companionate marriages, which means couples getting married who were not only each other's spouses, which of course all married couples were, but also each other's best friend. And this was novel. It was novel that this happened so frequently. Of course, it had happened occasionally before. Even with arranged marriages, couples do actually fall in love. Not always, but it can happen. For instance, in the 16th century, people noted of St. Thomas More, or Sir Thomas More as he then was, and his wife, that they were in love with each other, that it was a marriage of equals who loved each other. And people commented on it because it was so rare. It was a rarity, it was so rare that people noticed it. But by the beginning of the 17th century, this was beginning to become normal. And here's the interesting thing, that as this begins to become normal, as people's expectations of social life start to shift, you get a collapse of what I'm going to call, and what social scientists call, a homosocial world. Homosocial world, from homos meaning the same, and social meaning social. To imagine a homosocial world nowadays, you'd have to go to somewhere like Saudi Arabia, or less so, but still significantly so, Iran. Places where from a very young age, the children are separated by gender, and then the girls are brought up with the women and the boys are brought up with the men. And interchange between them is carefully chaperoned, let us say, organized and chaperoned. Marriage is organized, and socialization between the sexes is very carefully watched over. Now, the thing about a homosocial world is that, of course, there's no such thing as gay or lesbian. The homosocial world is the original world of don't ask, don't tell. It's where an awful lot of things go on, but don't ask, don't tell. Everything is invisible. Everything is very flexible. And people don't have what we would call sexual identities. They have the forms of behavior that are appropriate to the marriage system, essentially. No one thinks what you do sexually is important. What is important is that you fit into the role that you are given, getting married and having children. What happens outside that? Whoop, not very significant. The change that starts to happen with the arrival of companionate marriage and the invention of heterosexuality is that for the first time, it becomes clear that there are people who don't know how to play the new game. That there are people, if you like, who have been left high on the tide. Is that the word? No, high and dry by the outflowing tide. Because the horizons have changed. People now have emotional expectations of finding not only sexual, but also emotional companionship with someone of the opposite sex. People become each other's best friends. And it's from this time that you begin to get, for the first time, the first signs of what we would now call gay life. Molly houses, as they were then called, we now call gay pubs, cruising areas, where people started to become visible. And people began to notice that there were these other odd sort of people, the beginning of visibility. And of course, the beginning of visibility meant police attention. There weren't police in the formal sense, but there were certainly king's men who knew how to watch what was going on. And of course, this meant also that there was a particularly useful bunch of scapegoats for other problems. The king had cleverly, in the case of England, King Henry VIII had cleverly tarnished the monasteries with the title of hotbeds of sodomitical practices. That was part of his excuse for getting rid of them. But then it became useful to tar papists in general, and then Jesuits with sodomy as part of the kind of thing that those foreigners do. So the otherization, if you like, of this reality began to happen. It was a vitally important part of at least English, I don't know whether this is true in Scotland as well, English Protestant life, was that one of the things we were not like the papists and the pagans who have sodomy, which is one of the reasons, incidentally, why all English colonies have the same penal code with relation to to this matter, which luckily they're beginning to get rid of now. But the key thing that I want to bring out here was the visibility. People started to become visible, and at first, what had in the Middle Ages been a rather vague sin, the kind of sin, for instance, that King Richard the Lionheart, who was what we would call gay and also what we would call a psychopath, he confessed it publicly before every time he went into battle. But he professed it under the Latin phrase, ille peccato, that sin. Everyone knew what he meant. It would never cross any people listening to Richard the Conqueror's, Richard the Lionheart's mind that he meant something else. And indeed, when he finally died, his widow petitioned that the marriage be recognized as not having been consummated, so that she would be free to be remarried on the, the European marriage circuit for royal virgins. And it was granted immediately, since it never crossed anybody's mind that Richard might consummate a marriage. So anyhow, I hope you see that what was a vague sin in the Middle Ages became a crime at the beginning of the modern period and started having significant reprisals. And then it became a medical matter. As the 18th century drew on more and more attention, because there must be something wrong because these people were becoming more visible. There must be something wrong. What's wrong with the medicine? But of course, the trouble is there was nothing. But so people had to be tortured and imprisoned the same way. But attempts were made to study us. And this moved then into the 19th century, in the beginning of seeing, it must be a mental health issue. These people must be insane in some way, not in their right minds. And that was the stage of things. By the time towards the end of the 19th century, the discipline, which we now call psychology, began to appear with Freud and others. And it was in this period that for the very first time, in the year was 1869 or 1868, 1868 or 1869, that the word homosexual was invented. The word hadn't existed in any of our languages before. It was invented in German, and it's made from two words, a Greek word, homos, meaning the same, and a Latin word, sexus, meaning the same, sexual. So the homo doesn't come from the Latin homo, meaning man, which is why homosexual can refer to male homosexuals or female homosexuals. I mean, it comes from homos, meaning the same. And it was invented by an Austro-Hungarian, actually activist. He was trying to get the Prussian anti-sodomy laws changed. And he made the point that this was a certain sort of person. It wasn't a certain sort of criminal or a certain sort of disease, it was a certain sort of person. It was understood as a clinical definition, the homosexual. But for the first time, it was described as a sort of person, which meant that as the visibility had increased, so it had become possible to discard various of the presumed pathologies that had gone along with this strange being. It had been assumed either to be a vice in the Middle Ages or some sort of criminal pathology heading into the modern world. Now, an absolutely key thing happened, disastrous for many, but as it happens, of hidden benefit to gay and lesbian people, which was the mass mobilization of the two world wars. Because for the first time, hundreds of thousands of young men found themselves under arms, and hundreds of thousands of young women found themselves in armament factories. And this meant for the first time that if you came from Nothing Haddam in Essex, or Loch Nothing in Scotland, or Nothing Gulch in Tennessee, for the first time you were able to meet other people like yourself. You had thought you were the only gay in the village. And suddenly you found yourself with other people like yourself. And then when the war was over, if you'd survived it, which in the case of the First World War was a very risky proposition, on demobilizing, rather than going back to Loch Nothing, Nothing Gulch, or Nothing Haddam, you might move to Berlin or London or New York, because you knew that there would be other people like you. Or in the case of many women in America, Santa Fe in New Mexico, which became one of the first lesbian communes, if you like, in the 1930s. And the key thing about this, or this, I should say, the most interesting group where at last observers and scientists began to be able to observe this group of people was in Weimar, Germany. so in Berlin and other German countries, after the First World War. And that was when the first scientific studies about what we now call homosexuality were on, because for the first time, there was a critical mass of people who were sufficiently visible for the students, the psychologists, the scientists, to say what makes these people tick. But then this was brutally interrupted when the Nazis came to power. So from 1932 onwards, these studies were stopped and all the books were burnt. So very little survives of the initial studies made by this by the people of this group. Some of the scientists themselves managed to flee, but very little of the literature survives. But after the Second World War and in the United States, the Nazis didn't take over quite. I mean, there were attempts with the McCarthyites in the 1950s, but so there was a sufficient density of people once again for it to become apparent that they weren't presenting as problems. And eventually they challenged one of the leading scientists of the epoch, a woman called Dr. Evelyn Hooker. She has the rather lovely name of Evelyn Hooker. They challenged her to say, listen, you know us, you've seen us, you hang around with us. What is the pathology that we have in common? Because all the shrinks say, homosexuality, it comes from a certain pathology. I mean, early Freud thought that. Early Freud thought that there was something paranoid about gay men, at least, what we now call gay men. It later became apparent that maybe if you were a gay man in 1890s Vienna, you did have to watch out for people who were out for you. You might have had reason to be paranoid rather than it being something that was intrinsic to you. But a sufficient number of people were able to be observed, and they said to Dr. Hooker, "But make an experiment." And so she did. She devised an experiment taking the complete psychological profiles, as they were then considered, of 60 males. And then she challenged the rest of the industry, the rest of the discipline, to say, okay, you say you know which pathologies produce homosexuality, therefore you will be able to detect which of these people are gay and which of them are straight. And not one of the scientists was able to come close to identifying which was gay and which was straight. And there thus emerged that extraordinary thing, which is the banality of a genuine scientific discovery. When I say the banality of a genuine scientific discovery, it became clear that gay and lesbian people are just as screwed up as everybody else. No more and no less. The screwed upness has nothing to do with the sexual orientation. It's an extraordinary moment of banal reality when all the previous more or less scapegoating views of criminal, sin, pathology, vice, criminality, etc., when all of that, my God, here is a banal, stable reality. It's a non-pathological minority variant. I wonder what makes something like this tick. That's when a scientific question, as opposed to a witch hunting question, starts to be asked. And from the 1950s, that reality has become ever more clearly true as people have got to know more and more gay and lesbian people, and pacifically accepted, certainly by the medical profession and increasingly by the population at large. Okay, this poses a considerable problem to the church for various reasons. One, because the entire structure of sexual morality, which was founded in the 2nd century by Clement of Alexandria, was dependent that the only good sexual act could be the act of a marital act open to procreation. It was really Clement of Alexandria, following on from Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish Platonic philosopher, that gave us the package, which has lasted until Humanae Vitae. The necessity for a marital act to be good, that it must be open to procreation. And therefore, by definition, any marital acts that were not open to procreation failed to achieve their order. were disordered as to regards their object. And if someone had a stable tendency towards that, then the stable tendency was a disordered, an objectively disordered tendency. Stop me if you've heard this language before. But it meant that the whole of sexual morality had been made as a negative deduction from the marital act open to procreation, which means that it has been assumed, simply taken for granted, that what we now call gay and lesbian people were defective heterosexuals. And the really shocking thing that you start to get from the 1950s onwards, which gradually then finds its way into our various law frames, is that it becomes perfectly clear that gay and lesbian people are not intrinsically disordered straight people. They're not straight people at all. You can't deduce what a gay or lesbian person should do as if they were a defective something else. You have to work out what they are starting from where they are. The moment you recognize that a gay or lesbian person is the bearer of a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition, then it appears to all intents and purposes as though this is something created by God, which means that it has a purpose. It's for something. For some reason or other, God has made this. And if you let it flourish, we will discover what that for is, what the what for is for, as it were. We will discover what the end, the purpose, what part of God's glory God wants to show us by these people coming alive. And that's really been the basis of the discussion so far. The official organs of the church have held on to the only basis they have had for 1800 years to judge any of these matters, which is the assumption that everything is either a marital act open to procreation or a defect from that. The real problem for them is that that has meant assuming that that was genuinely a norm within the created order. But then the moment you have a regularly occurring non-pathological minority variant, that fact, an element of creation, shows that the norm is not true. And that's really where we are now. A long historical process by which something true has become clear about what is, which is why this is a matter of truth about what is long before it's a matter of sexual ethics or anything like that, which is why I think that's such an important part of the background to what we're talking about. We're not having an argument about which sex acts are appropriate or not. We're having an argument about whether we exist or not. The assumption of official church teaching has been we do not exist, that we are intrinsically heterosexual people who suffer from a grave objective disorder, which they refer to as same-sex attraction. In the same way that when they talk about trans people, they say, no, they aren't trans people, they are deluded if they think they really are a different gender from their visible biologically given sex at birth. They actually deny the existence because of the norm that they assume to be valid. Now, it's perfectly clear that the science of Clement of Alexandria and Philo of Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria was a contemporary of St. Paul. Clement was at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. That their science is not our science. That the relationship between God and what is has got bigger when we discover that something is a stable reality possessed of its own rules and its own possibilities of flourishing. So I think this is becoming increasingly clear. I was very delighted a couple of weeks ago when the Cardinal Archbishop of Luxembourg, Cardinal Hollerich, a Jesuit appointed by Benedict XVI, so initially at least quite a conservative figure, made it perfectly clear in an interview to a French Catholic newspaper that the current teaching has got to go because it's scientifically false. he was basically making the same point as I've been making to you. I've been making it for 25 years. He made it recently. And I'm glad to say that he did, because if he'd said it as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, he'd have been sacked for saying that. But it's now becoming perfectly clear that a teaching that demands some people regard themselves as a deduction from something else that they aren't in order to fit in to someone's scheme, that is no way to refer to somebody as a daughter or a son of God. Anyhow, I hope that's given a little background to how this issue has come. Sorry it's so rushed, but as you can imagine, an awful lot to cover in 40 minutes. 30 minutes.
Thank you very much for your contribution tonight. We'll turn to questions, and really just a reminder to everyone to share your questions to James through the chat area. Thank you to Gerard who's putting in those links there at the moment. So please do head over to the chat, share your comments, your thoughts and your questions to James that will inform our discussion over the next few minutes until probably around about 25 past. We'll take about half an hour of questions just now. And I know it's always this bit where folk will be furiously typing, James, as they start thinking about what to say. But I suppose in the first instance, we're coming into a series of conversations. This is the first of a series of conversations looking at LGBT people and their place in the church, and how perhaps that can be a challenge to us as well to create a more welcoming church. And in light of the background that you presented, perhaps a very dark background in history at times in particular, what can we do now? What's the next step? What's the first step to creating that welcoming church? Can you hear me, James?
I can hear you, yes. Oh, I thought you were asking other people to answer that.
Sorry, I'm throwing that to you just as a first question. What's the first step?
I think it's important for us to have a merciful take on how we got here, because it's easy to present the battle between modern science and religious dogma as a kind of an Enlightenment fencing match that goes on and on forever. But what I hope I've given you is actually a rather Christian account of the process of learning as we've ceased to scapegoat people. Over time, we are forgiven as we've learned not to scapegoat people. It's the ability to stand back from throwing stones that made it suddenly possible to see who people really were. And that, as it were, reached, as I say, a critical mass in the early years of the 20th century. And I think that it's that constant moving forward of reality that has tended to make it more difficult for people to hold the old line. But that's a merciful thing. That's not a battle from wicked people. It's what God's forgiveness looks like. It's what you would expect the forgiveness coming from the crucified one to look like, as people see what they've been doing in crucifying other people and say, gosh, do you know, that's what we did to Jesus. We shouldn't do that to other people. It seems to me that there's it's important to see that this has been actually a process of genuine human learning. It's not a matter of an ideology or someone's clever idea or something like that. It's being done as we stepped out of a certain way of being together. It's why it's so difficult for this issue to advance in residually homosocial societies. Because in residually homosocial societies, of course, nobody is gay. Because nobody is straight either. I don't mean that in the sense that they don't, the immense majority, of course, prefer sex with someone of the opposite sex, as in every society. but their form of socialization is not heterosexual, which means that all the men are together. So who knows who's gay and who's straight? In homosocial societies, you don't learn who's gay and who's straight until you have a presence of a woman among them. That was the experience, even within my lifetime, of the various public bodies that became sexually inclusive. I mean, I remember when fire departments in England, I don't know how long that happened in Scotland, when fire departments in England started to have women firefighters. Well, for the first time, the male firefighters learnt which of their members were gay. Why? Because the women found it easier to relate to the gay ones. And it became apparent because there was no erotic tension in the relationship. In other words, heterosexualization does automatically lead to the discovery of people who look at things in a different way. That's a merciful progress, not a wicked. It's a shift in relationships, which I think is which I think is very important to see. We learn relationally, and then we're able to understand rationally. Does that make sense?
It does, and perhaps if I could put a slightly personal question to you, do you ever tire of having to make these points again and again?
So I saw the comment there. Not really. I keep on trying to look at different ways to explain it better. So, because in one sense, it's terribly obvious. But in another sense, until it's part of a narrative that people can see, then it doesn't twig that it's got something to do with them. So I don't actually tire of saying it. I apologize if I sound bored. I'm not bored in repeating it. But I think that it's worth. I think that it's worth making available a narrative so that people can say, "Oh gosh, this is happening because of this, this, and this." We're in a direct line of something that's been going on actually for an awfully long time, and only now has acquired a sufficient visibility and talkability, and it makes sense. We're not casting aspersions. We're not blaming people for what they did in the past. Lord alone knows what people will blame us for in the future. But we've reached the stage whereby we now know something to be true that genuinely was not known before. And when that something is known as true, it has a whole lot of knock-on effects in other things we know to be true, for instance, about heterosexuals. One of the examples which I give, and this is something which I suspect that you, Callum, and the kids at your school and others of your generation will have noticed, which is that amongst the younger kids, where the boys no longer need to have the queer other by comparison with whom to make themselves men, it's perfectly clear to them that being gay is just a different part of masculinity. Well, if being gay is a different part of masculinity, then the need to conform to certain rigid expectations of what a man is weigh far less heavily on your average straight man than they would have done when there's being a man and then there's not a man, and that's what not a man looks like. That's a hell of a tough burden to bear for a straight person, let alone for the gay people who actually gets it in the neck at the time. Is that true, certainly in your school? I hope so.
Certainly, it's a powerful image to contemplate, certainly. And I'm going to turn to this question now, which says that if a psychologically healthy gay man decides to be a priest, is he not entering a system where he has to deny himself, deny the person that God made him? And is he not heading down a road then of risky mental health?
Yes. And he should be very careful. There are dioceses where the adults involved in the formation process are adult enough to talk about this in an adult way. And there are places where, no, he will be asked to play games of the don't ask, don't tell sort that will eventually have very bad mental health consequences for him. It's one of the, I mean, a fair number of young people come to me and say, I want to be a priest. Where do I go to be a priest? And of course, I don't, I'm afraid, have too many answers, because there aren't many places where I know that I will be telling them to talk to adult people who are aware that there is such a thing as a psychologically healthy gay man or lesbian woman, and where they can say so on joining without the bishop saying, please, I don't want to hear that, because if I know that formally, then I can't ordain you. This is farcical. That isn't certainly the official position. The official position is that gay men cannot be admitted to the seminary, because even if they are perfectly chaste, they are lacking some indispensable psychological agreement, which some cardinal pulled out of some hat of his, to say how we are incapable of paternity. I know how incapable I am of paternity. I have an adopted son to prove it, but he will no doubt be able to give you plenty of lectures on my incapacity for paternity, but I don't quite think that's what the cardinal I don't quite think that's what the cardinal meant. So yes, I mean, your psychologically healthy gay person needs to be very careful. There are certain religious congregations where this can be talked about honestly, and where they will honor a person's honesty and transparency. But there are others where they will ask him either formally or by nudge, nudge, wink, wink, to play games. And of course, that's not good for anybody. And it's certainly not good for the faithful to whom he will then minister,
James,
who are much more honest and aware of what's going on than most of these.
You mentioned there, James, a cardinal. I want to take you to another cardinal who you mentioned during your contribution, the cardinal from Luxembourg, who you mentioned. And we're asked in the chat, do you think this is a sign of change in the Curia overall? Do you think this is a sign of change in the approach that the church is taking at that level?
Obviously, I don't know too much about the individuals in the community. My guess is that when this new papal commission about the reorganizing of the Curia is finalized, which I hope will be within the next couple of months, the current head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith will retire. He's way past the retirement age, and someone else will be put in. I hope, very much hope, that will be a person who's known to be open to discussion in this area. The current guy isn't. He's not a particularly wicked man, the current guy, but I just don't think that he's open to that one. He was the one who signed, after all, the silly thing about not blessing gay same-sex partnerships. But that there has been a sea change, there has. I mean, the Cardinal of Luxembourg is not a curial cardinal, but he is the president of the European Bishops' Conference. That's to say, he's the highest ranking cardinal after the Pope and the Cardinal Secretary of State in the Vatican. Him saying that is permission to talk for an awful lot of people who might have been, do I dare, not dare? And that, alongside what a significant proportion of the German bishops' conference have said, makes it quite clear that this is now completely talkable about in these sort of terms. So there are places where people are more frightened. There are other places where people are just longing to be given permission to not feel that their jobs are in jeopardy if they say this. So yeah, I think that we are at pretty close to a tipping point on this one, if we haven't already passed it. I don't think this particular genie can be put back in the bottle.
And then perhaps, James, if we take a step back just to the discussion around the priesthood again, do you think that the challenges that those coming forward for the priesthood face in that regard, do you think that's a reason, or at least a factor, in lower numbers coming forward for the priesthood in religious life?
Oh yes, I've got no doubt about that. Again, I think that there's a historical shift on that. Remember that up until the 1950s, the Catholic priesthood was the safest place to be gay for many, and the Catholic religious sisterhood was the safest place to be lesbian for many Catholics, especially those from non-metropolitan areas, not big cities. Why? Because, I mean, outside the civil society was a world of fear, blackmail, disease, and murder with these things. This was a dangerous place. The safest place to be was a priest, because or a religious, because no one asked you where was your girlfriend or where was your boyfriend. Now, what's happened since the 1950s, as that scientific evidence has emerged, is, if you like, the bland hypocrisy of gays in the priesthood became a more real hypocrisy as it became less and less oppressive outside. As people started to get rights outside, be able to continue in higher education, get employment as themselves outside. So what had been, what I call a bland hypocrisy, the kind of don't ask, don't tell, which is genuinely quite merciful, starts to become an ever stricter don't ask, don't tell, because it's now being made formal, because there are the possibilities of being who you are outside. And I think that, yeah, that's part of the it's part of the reason why, even when a significant number of straight people left the priesthood, a very significant number of straight people left immediately after the Vatican Council, when it became clear that Paul VI was not going to relax the celibacy rule. So the proportion shifted dramatically, so the proportion of gay people became even higher within the priesthood than it was. But I think that partly the vocational decline since then is because, thank heavens, gay people can get a life outside of the priesthood as themselves. And I think that the church has proven to be an appalling employer. So the whole employment relationship, including possibilities of honesty and talking about things, is something that has to be looked at entirely independently of celibacy. It's really, how do we train people so that they can be honest? Yeah.
I know, James, that when you were with us previously, you spoke extensively around the scripture texts that are often used in the debate around sexuality. And while I don't want to necessarily spend another half an hour speaking about these, I do want to take up this question nonetheless, which asks, what was behind the Torah's judgment about homosexual acts, or indeed St. Paul's?
My theory, I mean, of course, there is no, formally speaking, there is no mention of homosexual acts in the Torah, except in 2 places in Leviticus. And no one is entirely sure what they mean because of the way they're placed and the actual words involved. The translation which is usually given is, you shall not lie, or thou shalt not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. But in fact, that's a mistaken translation, because it introduces the as with a, which compares, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It compares the kind of lying that's involved. But there is no such as with in the Hebrew. What the Hebrew in fact says is, thou shalt not lie with a male, thou shalt not lie the lyings of a woman. And that word lyings appears to refer to the degrees of kindred or affinity of a person through marriage. The only other place in the Hebrew scripture where that word appears exactly the same is where Jacob, Israel, kicks Reuben out of being his firstborn, or receiving the portion of his inheritance that will be owed to the firstborn, because you have gone up to the lyings of your father. And what is meant by the lyings of his father? Well, it meant that he had sex with his father's concubine. The phrase isn't, you've committed incest by sleeping with your mother, his mother was dead, Leah, or with your stepmother, Rachel, she was also dead, but with someone who wasn't formally speaking either his mother or his stepmother, but was in a place of kindred and affinity through his father, such that if Reuben had had any children by Bilhah, they would have been both his daughter or son and his sister or brother, because Rachel had given birth to two sons through Bilhah. I forget whether it was Dan or Asher. But so there was that was the problem. So I suspect that phrase, what the phrase is saying is, you shall not lie with the male equivalent of any of the previous list of women with whom you cannot lie because of affinity, kindred and affinity. Because the previous list is a list of female kindred and affinity, the sort of women you cannot lie with. I suspect that you shall not lie with the male equivalent of any of the above. And that, incidentally, is what would fit in with other ancient Middle Eastern law codes of the time. It would take too long to deal with St. Paul, but let me just say that I'm just finishing a book where I will deal with these texts, and I can assure you that the so-called mention by St. Paul really isn't. It's a mention of other things, but it really doesn't have anything to do with what we would call homosexual.
I think that's a really useful thing to address, and I think we know that it comes up so often in the debate. Yeah. It's useful to have that knowledge. And
I hope I'll have a book. I hope I'll have a book out for you soon.
I'm sure Rab will share that with the network once we've got that out. If I can turn then to a comment followed by a question, which says, I'm intrigued by your comment that now we have the space for LGBT plus people to thrive. We will discover God's purpose in creation. So from your own anthropological work, James, how would you hazard a guess as to what that might be, what that purpose might be?
I don't honestly know. I mean, some people, there's actually a very interesting TED talk by somebody I think called James O'Keefe, a professor, I think he's a cardiologist, who's one of whose sons is gay. And so he began to study it as a scientist. And he worked out something which he then found replicated, which is how often the gay or lesbian nodes become peacekeepers within different groups of family. When there are squabbles elsewhere, it's his son and his partner who sort out different family issues. So there's some suggestion that it's a peacekeeping device. It's one of God's ways of allowing family life to be less tense, or human togetherness life less tense, is to have these nodes where people are half in and half out, and comparatively okay with each other, but not caught up in some of the, sort of the notion that guncles and lants, as I believe they're called, gay uncles and lesbian aunts, have specific roles in the order of creation, may turn out to be something true. But we're in early days, because it's going to take some time when we get people for whom being who they are has just always been obvious, rather than people who are still fighting off all the time when they couldn't be who they are. So I think that that's something which we're going to be discovering more of. Once you're able to allow people to start to be who they are, then it's going to become a lot easier to see what lights are shining and why. Does that make sense?
Definitely, thank you. And perhaps taking it in a slightly different direction, does your presentation illustrate the fact that as a church, we're not encouraged to look beyond what's real and human? The questioner says, are we living in artificial bubbles, afraid to face up to what's really outside the current narrow church parameters?
Yes, but I think that one of the things that I hope is true, and this is something which I think the whole synodal process I think is going to be looking at, is that the church has lost its ability to enforce belonging in the same way that it might have, by which I mean most of us now, especially after COVID, really have to make a choice to belong to something. It's not a natural form of belonging, which is therefore policed according to natural rules, just the way it is in my village or the way it is in my neighborhood. Why? Because, well, we have so many different ways of semi-belonging to this and semi-belonging to that. So when people try to force us into, as this person says, an artificial bubble, actually we live in so many different bubbles. The little bits of the other reality keep on breaking through. I think the interesting question is, how do we help create a much bigger bubble that is less artificial? All human bubbles are artificial. They're all cultural. But what is it going to be like to take part in the creation of a much bigger bubble, which is much more representative of what humans really are? And I think that we're getting there slowly. I think that that really is part of what the whole walking together and talking and discussing the synodal path is. Does that make sense?
It does, and I wonder, it strikes me that effectively what you're saying, James, is that we root this in the social teaching, the dignity of the human person, that has to be the core message.
Mm-hmm. Yep. As Pope Francis said, about the baptismal priesthood is what it's all about. And I think that that's the absolute right thing. Once people discover that they are sons and daughters of God as they are, and are able to speak as such and be heard as such, listen to, oh my gosh, yes, he's not only, as it were, a queer weirdo, he is a son or a daughter of God, or she is a daughter of God, and they're speaking truthfully and they're bearing witness. And that means that my preconceptions can't be right. I think that it's that level, strangely, it's at that weak level of ordinary talking between people. That's where people become convinced.
Now, James, we've spoken a lot about the notion of don't ask, don't tell, and particularly among the clergy. But the next question asks about the relevance to this of this to lay Catholics as well, who are absolutely, and who find themselves having to hide that, or feeling the need to hide that within parish life. Could you say something about that and the impact of them?
Yes, and I agree. I think it's absurd. One of the most urgent changes that's needed, and I was very glad to see how well the Germans were picking this up, is public recognition that sexual orientation and indeed marital status within sexual orientation cannot be used for reasons of employment discrimination. I was very pleased to see, I mean, in Germany, for instance, as I understand it, the church is exempt from applying ordinary rights of employment. It's exempt from applying them to gay and lesbian people. They can if they want. But I'm glad to say that a significant number of bishops and vicars general of the major dioceses in Germany have said, we hereby pledge to put down that right. We're going to waive that right definitively, so that we regard ourselves as beholden to the same employment laws as everybody else. And I think that's hugely important. I don't know what the state is in England with relation to between the hierarchy and the Catholic schools or Scotland, but I think that something similar must happen. The moment you realize that there is no good reason why you should be able to discriminate or ask for discretion about a regularly occurring non-pathological minority variant in the human condition. The moment you realize that, it makes no sense to demand our right to, our sacred right to discriminate against such people. So yes, but I think that unfortunately, given the churches have always tried to insist on rights to have then they are going to have formally to waive it. That's going to be a real battle in the United States.
What about in the same sense, James, taking employment out of it, and just in terms of the lay Catholic attending Mass, trying to be a part of the parish community, and what can, what is undoubtedly a challenge that can face them to perhaps hide that element of who they are?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult one, depending on what they've got available. And one of the things that SNL might do is, if you haven't already, when you may have done it already, is to produce a list of gay-friendly parishes where because you know other people from the parish, or other people from the parish have told you, or you know the priest, that such demands are not made on, that they're welcome to be who they are. And I think that it should become known that parishes are opening and welcoming places. They actually mean what they say when they sing the dreadful "All are welcome." I think it's worth seeing if a list can be made so that people come available. So that if people come to you saying, or come to Quest, I'm sure saying, I'm really frightened in my parish. Is there anywhere in such and such a town where you know that I might be myself?
I think that could be a really powerful exercise. And I wonder if I could turn then to the next question. I think that would be a powerful step in the first instance. But the next question suggests that from this conversation, there may be an empowerment to raise a pastoral conversation with the bishops in Scotland around ministry to and support of the LGBT plus community. How would you suggest that's taken forward?
I think you have much better people than me to suggest that. They don't really like talking to me. I think the reason is because they agree with me off the record and don't want to tip their. I think that Quest and Ruby, who's part of Quest, but also part of the global network of Rambo Catholics, have got an excellent record of very quiet, non-stage grabbing, non-headlight hunting negotiations with bishops, with very good results of things set up in different dioceses. So I think you have real expertise more available to you. I can't even get I've been here 7 years, I can't even get the Cardinal Archbishop of Madrid to reply to an email.
And I'm sure it's a conversation that we'll be able to pick up over the coming weeks as well as we journey through Lent. But I noticed that Ruby has also been name-checked in another comment, around that success previously.
Indeed.
That's powerful.
And have any of your bishops spoken out and said the equivalent of we've really got to move on this, or have they not yet reached the stage where they're?
Certainly not that I'm aware of.
No, they're still in deep Keith Patrick terror.
I'm going to turn to the next question, James, and I think it's a really important one, because we've spoken a lot tonight around our place as sons and daughters of God, and that role that we have as sons and daughters of God, no matter who we are and no matter our sexual orientation. And the questioner asks, how might a young person, say age 11 or 12, who's come out as non-binary, using pronouns they, them, how might they relate to being a son or daughter of God?
Daughter of God, yeah. Well, I think, if I may say, I think that you must find someone who can speak of that in the first person. I certainly don't want to. I don't want to impose. Here in Spain, because we have the possibility, a strange linguistic possibility, which I don't think you really have in English, which is that a son is hijo, a daughter is hija, but they've come up with a new form for non-binary, which is putting an E instead of an O or an A. So hijes has become an increasingly common way of being gender inclusive, so that someone can describe themselves as an hije of God. But neither the word son nor the word daughter allows themselves to be to be modified in that way. I use the word bairn, which I know is Old English and possibly Scottish as well. I'm told actually simply means child in Norwegian. So it probably comes to us from the Viking. But that's not a bad non-gender specific word. But it does tend to mean child, and that's the problem, because when we talk about the son or daughter of God, or the ihe of God, the point is not the childish nature of it. The point is equality. That's something which lots of these discussions don't bring out. It's beautifully brought out in St. John's Gospel, where the Jewish authority says Jesus, he calls himself the Son of God, thereby making himself equal with God. The son or daughter is a term of equality, not a term of subalternity. Whereas, alas, our word child, which is gender-free, is also a word of subalternity. It's a minor.
I'd say bairn is definitely a term that's familiar to our Scots audience. Definitely,
yeah. But is bairn necessarily a term with associations of minority? I mean, a minority of age.
I think bairn would translate as child in Scots.
As child, yeah.
I said, but the questioners come back, James, and asking, is child of God, is that one that works, or do you think there's too many challenges with it?
As I said, the problem with the word child is that for us, child is always a dependent state in the sense of minority. Whereas the Greek word huios, in this case, needs to be translated by something that is someone of equal status. When we're talking to Jesus, we're not talking about to someone who's under God. We're talking about God's equal, who is here, who is God. That's the sense in which son is referred to Jesus. It's the sense of equality. And alas, for us, the words tend to have more of a dependent than an equal sense. But I agree that I think that there's a challenge. Whatever word we use will need a gloss.
I suppose Gerard's come in the chat to say, to have the conversation with the person, much like what you were saying yourself, James,
Yes.
To listen to
Yes.
the person, support them to explore language that works for them.
And I hope that will you be, during this Lenten process, will you be having conversation with such a person?
I believe so.
Yeah. If not an 11 or 12-year-old, then with somebody a bit.
But definitely, I think a very useful conversation to have. Perhaps time for just one final question, James, and I wonder, the quote, the quote, if we don't learn from the mistakes of history, we're doomed to repeat them. Is it good enough simply to address the issues, or is it important in our parish settings and our church settings to understand the history? And is that key to moving forward?
Well, I think that when you understand the history, you understand better why we're not talking about a change of ideology or some piece of clever thinking or some piece of, metropolitan woke elite. We're talking about how slowly and painfully something that is real about what is has emerged in the midst of us, and how the recognition that that is a good thing is part of how we respect the Creator. That's why I try to bring it out historically, because it gives us a much more relaxed sense of what we're doing. This is not a clever discussion. It wasn't clever people who decided that gay people ought to be treated recently. It was the fact that over time, we violent people were unable to find anything wrong with them and began to be able to think, oh my God, they're just like us. In other words, we discovered that something was real by learning to love our neighbor as ourselves. That is how the gospel works.
I'm going to fit one more in then, James, just to take the message behind the question that's just been added. Does the synod give us hope? How do we journey with the comments of so many parishioners who are engaging in the synod, saying that LGBT issues need to be at the heart of how we move forward, and that we need to be more accepting of gay, lesbian, bisexual Catholics in the church today? How do we move forward, and does that give us hope as we move through the synod?
Yes, I think so. I think that it's astounding how many groups from how many countries are saying the same thing. And the message is coming pretty loud and clear, and appears to be being received well by the Vatican office in charge of collating these things. So yes, I think the question is how to
how do we journey with the tension between those who do have that opinion and those who equally advocate the opposite?
The opposite. Well, I think they must just be asked to explain why they think this is true and why it needs to be reinforced at this time. I mean, because if they think that the teaching comes from the Bible, well, even the Pontifical Biblical Commission says it doesn't. If they think it comes from natural law, well, then they have to explain why they really genuinely, in their heart of hearts, after meeting gay and lesbian people, think that gay and lesbian people are defective heterosexuals. What is this defect in them? Where is the defect to be found? How does it manifest? I just think that, just say, okay, this is what you hold, and you've been given reasons to hold this by the church. Which of them is the true one? What's the true reason for holding this? So for some of them, it just may be a sign that they're fed up with changes, and they regard this as a sort of a fashionable issue. They're just annoyed that fashionistas are running the show. Well, okay, there may be fashionistas running the show, but actually there are an awful lot of real people who are distinctly unfashionable and who also need to be able to breathe deep and have a life.
Well, James, on that note, huge thanks for joining us. Huge thanks for the conversation tonight. Thanks to everyone who contributed to the conversation, brought forward questions and thoughts. And I will hand over now to Gerard. We should see the option to unmute coming up.
You're still mute.
There we go.
Thank you. I couldn't unmute for some reason. I was clicking away. Thanks, Callum. Anyway, the last time you were with us, James, I was kind of doing a bit of digging back as I was preparing for this evening, and I noticed that the date was the 5th of November, 2020, when you were talking on the theme of LGBTI people in the church. And I had a bit of a smile because my immediate thought that kind of then started to ferment in my mind was that, of course, the 5th of November is, well, I think of it as fireworks night. And it struck me that tonight and the last time, and probably every time I listen to you these days, you often set off a great display of fireworks for people. But firework night, of course, for some people can be just a series of loud, irritating bangs that they don't like, and they will always fail to see beyond that irritation. And I think that last question perhaps hints at some of that. For others, the evenings are about togetherness with their chosen or their biological families. And for others, again, there's an evening of incredible fireworks lighting up the sky, filling them with joy, and perhaps illuminating the world in glorious colours, but also showing the world as it is, and as a result, how it can be. And certainly when I listen to you, I think there's something about those latter two for me. We're here this evening with a chosen family, and I think you bring great illumination to the challenges that we face, both as LGBT plus people, but also we're in a room of people who are willing to explore the issues that we're faced with. So yeah, definitely the latter two for me. So I want to thank you both for contributing to the evening, but also contributing to the wider dialogue within our church, and for feeding those of us for whom this food has often been quite sparse, but is vitally important. It's always a joy, and I always feel more complete after I've spent time listening to you or spent time with you. So from me, a thank you, and I'm sure that thank you from everyone who's here this evening. Thank you, James. And so now, if I can lead us in a prayer for James. Loving God, we thank you for the wisdom and insight of James. We thank you for what he has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint him anew, such that his ministry may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen.
Amen. And now we close by praying for all of us who are gathered here tonight. Come, Spirit of fire, in our broken and divided world, help us to burn with the passion of Jesus. Come, Spirit of truth, empower us such that we may live and walk in the truth of Jesus. Come, Spirit of love, and empower us to love as Jesus loved. And thank you, all of you, for being with us here tonight. And just before we go, a reminder that tomorrow is the last in the series Stolen Lives. This series has sought to listen to survivors of abuse and those who've journeyed with them. And tomorrow is an open forum with all the speakers that have been with them so far. You can still register on the Root and Branch website. And then for our own series, Thursday of next week, the 3rd of March, we welcome Ruby as our companion, inclusion and diversity. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much for being with us. Particularly thank you to James